Once again they were high in the skies above Sommerlund. Far below them the Kai were being massacred, but up here they could hear only thin shrieks, all but drowned by the shrill chattering of the attackers. They circled warily about each other. Then Alice became the season of summer, spreading its warmth across all Sommerlund. She threw pastel shades over the land, her very being drawing the ripe corn from its shy planting. The trees were rich with blinding green. Bright flowers burst from the ground to wave their gaudiness in the hot summer air. Children laughed and lazed in the sun, or kicked a ball around a lush field. She laid her shoulder on the land, and the land became bountiful, her eyebrows with the richness of the brown earth. But then the illusion began to fall apart. Blight struck the trees, and their leaves wrinkled and died, falling to form a soft and poisonous mulch on the ground that was now barren. Glaciers slid from the mountains, invading the lowlands and grinding everything in their path into shattered debris. The crops perished, and the children clutched their distended stomachs and wailed in their starvation. The sun was small and distant, and its weak rays were unable to penetrate the almost perpetual cloud cover. All of Sommerlund was a bleak grey. "You hold me at bay, sorcerer, but you cannot defeat me." As if she had rubbed a cloth over the canvas on which they had both been painting, the colors merged and ran. The rivulets of paint reformed themselves into new patterns until slowly there emerged a picture of a high mountain peak where the wind blew the loose snow into great clouds of coldness. The sun and the moon hung together in the icy sky. There were two people in the picture, standing on the peak and leaning with difficulty into the gale. One was a raggedly clad young girl, the other a tall, strong man dressed in the star-studded blue robe of the Brotherhood of the Crystal Star. Vonatar recognized himself. Rime filled his beard and his hair so that he looked as if he were in the last years of his life. And then he was there on the mountain-top. He fell forward and his fingers were frozen as they scrabbled in the snow. He raised his head and his eyes were fathomless depths of blackness as he directed his stare towards the girl. He conjured all of his fury and his vengefulness and wove them together into an idea of terrible darkness and power. This idea he shaped, using the knowledge he had gained from the Nadziranim. Once it was ready, he launched it with deadly speed from those cavernous eyes. But as he did so, he gave a great moan of despair. Alice was no longer standing there in front of his gaze. He turned his head and saw her, sitting unconcernedly on an ice-encrusted rock, rubbing her hands together to keep them warm. "No," she thought while his mind was still in confusion. "It's not that I moved. I've been sitting here all the time. I didn't even have to create an illusion. You did that yourself. You believe too much in yourself. When your mind creates a false reality, it never occurs to you to question it in any way. If I'd called your attention to where I'm sitting, you'd have heard nothing and seen nothing." "That's a lie," Vonatar's thought hissed and spat through the wild air between them. "Yes, you've caught me out again," thought Alice with a shrug. "You see, I can change the future just a little, far less than I would wish to. But I can also change the past. Not very much and not very often. But you were right when you saw me standing over there," she pointed, "because I was in the past that might have been. Only I've changed that past now. It never existed. In the past that I've created, I've been sitting here ever since we came to this mountain top." The rock beneath her cracked angrily asunder, and she leapt aside hastily. "Vonatar, our battle is over." "Never! Not until you die." "Oh, you're the one who's going to die, but not for a very long while yet. You may be powerful, but you're not invulnerable. What I meant was that our battle is over for now, and that I've won." "I don't believe you." "Yes, but it's true. Zargana and his hordes have left the monastery now. Its proud walls are nothing more than heaps of rubble, and the flames are consuming its heart. The bodies of the Kai are gutted monstrosities scattered among the ruins, twisted with those of the Giaks and the Kran and all the other beasts you led into Sommerlund. Even now, your foul allies are combing through the surrounding countryside, slaughtering any Somlending they find. Zargana is among them. Vonatar's thoughts were whining like those of a child unexpectedly thwarted. And what of it? Surely this means that victory is mine. No, Vonatar, because you have given me a very useful gift. Just a little time. As I said, I can't change the future very much, but with your help, and whether you know it or not, you've been helping me, I can alter it just very slightly more. Enough to ensure that by the time you return to the reality which belongs to Magnamund, it will be too late for you to do something which I don't want you to do. What? Take a single life, a very important life. And whose life might that be? The life of a boy. Which boy? I think I've told you enough. But I thank you for the gift you've given to me, and I'd like to give you a gift in return. The air howled around them. I do not trust your gifts, woman. But I've already given it to you. Don't be so ungracious. Look at yourself, Vonatar. A mirror appeared in the snow in front of him, and in it he saw the reflection of his own face. His beard, his hair, and his eyebrows were white from the ice, and his face was cold and pinched in the searing cold. His back was buckled with the weight of years. His eyes had withdrawn deep into their sockets, and the light in them was feeble. His cheeks were sunken and his lips thin. There were wrinkles in his tall brow. In this infernal, freezing place, his face looked like that of an old man. That's right, Vonatar. It is the face of an old man, because the gift I've given you is age. And it's a present that you'll never be able to give away, I'm afraid, because I was so sure you'd like it that I locked it into your very soul. Woman, I'll not rest until I laugh at your screams as you meet your slow destruction. Then you'll never rest at all, Vonatar. Alice trudged through the snow to stand over him, and as if in an afterthought, leant down to pat him on the head, rather as she might have patted a pet dog. Vonatar was among the clouds, and now he was alone. He reached out exhausted mental probes, searching for Alice's presence, but there was nothing. Fatigue filled every cell of his body, but this was as nothing to the fatigue that filled his mind. It was all that he could do to hold himself aloft. He looked at his hand. It was lined and creased with fingers now twisted claws. Its back was covered with liver spots. He turned it over and saw the leatheriness of his palm. He ran his tongue around his teeth and found that many of them were missing. The daylight seemed dimmer than it had been before, but he realized this had nothing to do with the passage of time. No, his eyes were now the dim eyes of a man in the twilight of his years. He had received Alice's gift, and he knew completely that it was one which he could never get rid of. He had the power to make himself virtually immortal, but forever he would be old. Banadon ran as fast as he could through the thick forest, whip-like branches lashing at his face and legs. The light was strangely musty in here, as if it had been filtered through black muslin. It made it hard for him accurately to judge distances, and so, more than once, he ran straight into a tree trunk. The taut roots of creepers tugged at his ankles. He could hear Kran and Giax thrashing through the foliage to his rear. If anything, they were moving even more clumsily than he was. The thought gave him renewed hope as he struggled onwards. He had no idea which way he was headed. For all he knew, he could be running directly away from the monastery. But the fulfillment of his mission was now the last thing on his mind. All he was concerned about was self-preservation. There was a cackle of triumph above him. He looked up. A Kran hovered on the breeze, its rotting eyes staring directly into his own from a distance of no more than 40 feet. He raised his hands as if to protect himself, but in fact he was shaping a thought. He clapped his palms together, and the smoking body of the headless Kran floated away sideways to land with a crash in the high branches. It was a minor victory, Banadon knew. The death of the beast could do nothing but draw attention to him, but at least his life would last a few minutes longer. Also, now that he had faith in his own magical abilities, he was able better to fight off his attackers. He made his way more slowly, but much more quietly, further into the forest. There was a clearing ahead. His first instinct was to shun it. It was in the clearings that he was at his most vulnerable from the overhead squadrons of Kran. Still, it drew him forward. For the last few yards before the trees cleared, he crawled, placing his hands and knees carefully so as not even to risk rustling the low-lying scrub. He saw the ruins of an ancient temple left behind by some long-forgotten civilization. Stones were tumbled upon each other in grotesque disarray. Moss covered areas which had once been mosaic floors. One of the walls had fallen flat in its entirety and was now perfectly preserved but horizontal, the blankness of its windows staring eyelessly up to the sky. Here was a possible hiding place. The last place that the forces of darkness would think he might try to conceal himself was in a clearing, yet there was plenty of shelter among the fallen masonry. The decision was forced upon him. The woods were suddenly filled with the gruntings of Giaks as they fought with the branches which obstructed them. The sounds were very close, at best a few 100 feet away. He found difficulty in moving. His body was tired not only from his physical exertions, but also from the unremitting agony of his magical performances. Death seemed almost an attractive idea, but he banished this thought from his mind. The deaths inflicted by the troops of the Dark Lords were often prolonged and cruel. Better to die swiftly in combat than to be captured and... He ran as swiftly as he could to the protection of a fallen pillar. He forced his body under it, pressed between the ancient stone and the moist, odoriferous, mossy earth. He tried not to breathe in case his hoarse panting might draw attention to him. He lay there for almost an hour, and it seemed that the Giaks and Kran had given up the chase, for he could hear nothing from the forest except the movements of the branches and the fidgeting of the leaves. The pain was leaving him now, and he was breathing easily. But he couldn't lie here forever. Sooner or later, the squadrons of Zargana would come across him as they scoured the forest. He had to move, but which way? He was completely lost. It was obvious that he was now behind the lines of the advancing army. Wherever he went, he would still be in danger. Toran was an obvious goal, but for all he knew, Toran too had fallen to the enemy. Still, going in any direction was a better option than staying here. The one advantage that he had, apart from his magic, was that he was mobile. The more he moved about, the less likely the Giaks would be able to pinpoint his position. As quietly as he could, he slithered snake-wise out from beneath the pillar. He was just pulling himself to his feet when he heard the sound of a steel-shod boot clipping a stone. A voice said, "Zazgog rek okaka." Spinning round, Bannerton found himself facing an armed patrol of Giaks. For a full second they didn't notice him, or perhaps they couldn't credit the evidence of their eyes. Then one of them cried accusingly, "Orgadak!" All heads turned towards him, and weapons were hefted threateningly. Bannerton felt his heart pumping wildly. He raised his palms to fend off the foe, but he knew that there were too many of them, and that his stocks of magical energy were sorely depleted. Still, he felt satisfaction as a sharp blade of blue light neatly decapitated one of his attackers. "Take as many of them with me as I can," ran his fragmented thoughts. An arrow sailed over his shoulder and made a brittle clink as it fractured against a gargoyle. Consciousness came slowly to Silent Wolf. He was a small child, lying in his parents' bed in the morning, having crawled in there for a time of huggings and caressings before the day properly began. He was a hawk, circling high over the land, with a fat pigeon flying leisurely below him, oblivious to his presence. He was a mystic hermit, dwelling in solitariness in a cave high on a bleak mountainside, fed by the wild animals which would bring him foods and then hurry away. It came to him that he was none of these things. He was a youth lying on the forest floor, his head aching from a swelling bruise. The smells of grass and the dead leaves of the previous autumn were strong in his nostrils. Something dreadful had happened, but he couldn't remember what it was. Something to do with the sun dying in the sky, something to do with the great beating of 1,000,000 wings. Then memories came rushing cruelly back. He could see the darkening of the sky as the vast flight of Kran descended pitilessly upon the monastery. How long ago had it been? A few seconds, said a part of his mind. An eternity, said another part. He heard and smelled all the dismal signals of destruction, but he still couldn't pull himself up from the comfortable grassy couch where he lay. This was surely a dream. But what if it's not a dream? Someone said to him. Then he thought, then it must really have happened. Exactly. But that must mean that everyone I care for is dead. I can't believe it. This must be a nightmare. I sent you a nightmare once before, but this is no nightmare. This is as near to truth as reality ever approaches. It's important that you understand this, and very quickly. You must take your memories of what has happened to the king at Holmgard, and you must offer yourself as his servant. Silent Wolf dragged himself to his hands and knees. He knew that whoever it was who was speaking in his mind was speaking the truth. Was it somebody from outside him, or was it simply the part of his mind that retained its full sanity? He didn't know, and the question was irrelevant. The important point was that the words the voice spoke were true ones. The monastery, when he reached it, was a spectacle of carnage. Even after the very last of the Kai had been slaughtered, the Dark Lord Zargana had ordered his troops to go on a further orgy of destruction. Massed forces of Giax and Kran had come together to push down the strong walls, and then even to attack the remains with swords and axes, so that not a single stone remained mortared to another. Their bestial treatment of the corpses of the Kai, whether they were men, women, or children, had been even more extreme. When Silent Wolf came across the body of a beautiful young woman of roughly the same age as himself, he gagged. She had died, clearly, when a spear had transfixed her throat, but some creature had, with glee, eaten out her heart. He fell to his knees and vomited. There were noises around him, not just the crackling of the flames, which even now were eating out the insides of the monastery's debris. Although the main force of the invaders had departed, it was only too clear that many of them had been left behind to seek out any Somlending who might survive in the area. His main objective might be to reach Holmgard, as the inner voice had told him, but his first priority was to leave this place. He thought of the river. Always before, when life felt bad, he had resorted to swimming in the river. The forest beyond was like a mother to him. It soothed him in times of personal misery. He knew the quiet ways there better than anyone else. It was his own personal kingdom, the place where he could walk unafraid. The woods on this bank of the river were like a best friend, but those on the far side had a closer relationship even than that. The forest seemed to him right now the only place where he could feel any sense of security. He wiped the tears from his eyes. His mouth tasted stale and acid from his vomit. He picked up his own axe on recovering consciousness. Now he added to his weaponry a broadsword and a short but deadly sharp dagger, tucking both of them into his belt. Lying on the blood-stained grass was a map, its edges charred. Without quite knowing why, he picked it up and stuffed it clumsily into his pocket. Taking these things from the dead seemed like sacrilege, but at the same time he knew it was necessary. It was only too obvious to him that he was the last of the Kai. Scuttling from bush to boulder, he headed warily for the river. One of the Giax was taller than the rest. It was dressed from head to foot in black chain mail, and it grinned evilly as it moved towards Bannerton. Its cat-o'-nine tails swished wickedly in the air as it advanced. Bannerton retreated towards the forest's edge. He summoned up still further magical energy from his scant resources, and the Giac's limbs slowly came adrift from its body, so that with an expression of total surprise, it collapsed in pieces onto the grassy flatness that had once been the temple's floor. Funny, thought Bannerton, that now I'm staring death directly in the face, I'm no longer frightened of it. The remaining Giacs stalked towards him. They exchanged words he couldn't properly understand, but he was able to gather that they reckoned he was easy prey. An archer shot another arrow at him, and he deflected its flight only with difficulty. His reserves were practically exhausted by now. He could make one more arrow veer away from him, perhaps, but it was unlikely that he could slay a Giac. He sensed, rather than saw, a figure burst from the undergrowth behind him. This is it, he thought, with a calmness that surprised him. he turned to meet his fate. The figure that met his eyes was that of a young man, clad in a green tunic and trousers and in a green cape. He was soaked from head to foot. His face was knotted in grim intensity. He carried an axe from whose blades ichor dripped. He snarled at the Giacs, and at once they began to retreat. Leaderless, they were incapable of standing up to any enemy that might carry the attack to them. They held for a moment, and then fled crashingly into the forest. Once the Giacs had gone, the two youths stood half bent over, breathing heavily. The sun was directly overhead, illuminating everything in the clearing with a strange, unnatural light. "I thank you," said Bannerton, recovering his breath. "There's no need to thank me. Driving off the creatures of darkness is reward enough in itself." "You're from the Kai Monastery," said Bannerton, recognizing the style of the tunic. "Are you out hunting, or—" "There's no Kai Monastery any longer." "But I have a message for your Grand Master," Bannerton protested uselessly, fumbling in the pockets of his robes. "There are no Kai anymore, except me." "Then I suppose my guildmaster would want me to give the message to you," said Bannerton. He realized that the exercise was pointless, but felt he had to go through with it nevertheless. He held out the scroll which the guildmaster had given him 100 years ago. No, it had been only a couple of days. The youth in green opened it and read for a few moments. "It's too late. Far too late," he said eventually. "Magician, journeyman, call yourself what you will. The Kai are no more, and Sommerlund is doomed. But together perhaps we could—" "Even together, what could we hope to do against the forces of the darkness? They're all around us, and sooner or later they're bound to find us." "Well, we can try. I've a friend who might help us, but she's, well, strange. I can't really guarantee that she will." "Who is this friend?" "She's called Alice, and my name is Bannerton. What's yours?" "A good question." Silent Wolf looked up at the green leaves dancing in the rays of the bright sun. He saw the innocent insects buzzing industriously around the fecund blossoms, and he felt the ground beneath his feet. There was just the slightest of chances that he and this fool might make their way through the countryside to Holmgard. A sough of wind caressed his cheek. He felt miserable in his wet clothing, yet the discovery of even a single ally brought some warmth to his shivering body. He looked directly at the sun, and he felt its strength flow into him. For the second time in his life, he discarded a name. "Lone Wolf," he said. "Yes, that's my name. Lone Wolf."